Imagine standing on land where human stories have been carried for more than 65,000 years. Before the pyramids rose from the sands of Egypt, before Stonehenge, before the world's first great cities, people were already living here. They raised families, they studied the seasons, they managed the landscape, and they preserved knowledge by passing it from one generation to the next. Then, one morning, unfamiliar ships appeared on the horizon. The people aboard those ships called Australia a new land. But it was not new. It had never been empty, and the arrival of those ships would begin a struggle that continues to shape Australia today. Many history books begin Australia's story in 1788, but beginning there is like opening a 1,000-page book near its final chapter and pretending nothing important happened before it. Before British colonisation, Australia was home to hundreds of distinct Aboriginal nations and language groups. Each had its own country, its own traditions, its own laws, and its own way of understanding the world. Knowledge was carried through stories, songs, ceremonies, and art. Songlines could preserve directions across enormous distances. A story could contain a map, a ceremony could carry history, and a painting could connect the present generation with ancestors from the distant past. For many Aboriginal peoples, the land was not simply something to be owned. It was country. Country was identity. Country was responsibility. Country was home. Archaeological discoveries at Majid Bebe suggest that people were living in northern Australia at least 65,000 years ago. At Lake Mungo, evidence of ancient ceremonial burial shows that people were honouring their dead more than 40,000 years ago. Australia's earliest history was not written on paper, it was preserved in the land. But when Britain claimed the continent, it refused to recognise the systems already operating there. Instead, the colonisers accepted a dangerous fiction. They claimed the land belonged to no one. For thousands of generations, Aboriginal communities lived across radically different environments. In the north, people adapted to tropical coastlines and powerful monsoon seasons. In the centre, communities developed detailed knowledge of desert water sources. In the south, people lived among rivers, mountains, forests, and grasslands. Survival required extraordinary observation. People needed to understand animal behaviour. They needed to recognise seasonal changes. They needed to know when plants could be eaten and when certain areas needed time to recover. But this knowledge went beyond survival. Communities developed systems of trade, education, diplomacy, and environmental management. Fire was sometimes used carefully to renew the landscape, encourage new plant growth, and reduce dangerous fuel buildup. Knowledge was inherited with a responsibility. Learn it, protect it, and pass it forward. The colonizers believed they were bringing civilization, but they had entered lands shaped by ancient systems they did not yet understand. In January 1788, the First Fleet established a British colony at Sydney Cove. To Britain, this was the beginning of settlement. To the people already living there, it was the beginning of an invasion. The colonists claimed territory. They cut down trees. They built permanent structures. And as the colony expanded, fences began appearing across the landscape. But these fences represented more than boundaries. They blocked access to hunting grounds. They separated communities from water. They prevented people from reaching places of cultural importance. The newcomers behaved as if the land had been waiting for them, but it had not. Every river had a history. Every path had meaning. Every piece of country was connected to someone. Conflict became unavoidable. Aboriginal resistance was often recorded by colonial authorities as criminal violence, but the people fighting were not attacking someone else's homeland. They were defending their own. Pemulwuy resisted colonial expansion around the Sydney region. Elsewhere, Aboriginal communities fought against settlers who occupied their lands. Some launched direct attacks. Others disrupted supplies. Some negotiated. Others moved deeper into country to protect their families. There was no single frontier war. There were many. They happened in different places and at different times. Some continued for decades. The names of countless Aboriginal defenders were never recorded by the people writing colonial history, but their resistance remained part of community memory. They had seen their world changing, and they refused to surrender without a fight. Violence was not the only force destroying communities. Disease moved even faster than the settlers. Epidemics spread among people who had little immunity to illnesses introduced from overseas. Families lost elders. Children lost parents. Communities lost the people who carried their laws, languages, and memories. As settlers took more land, Access to food and water became increasingly difficult. Displacement created hunger. Hunger created dependence. And dependence gave colonial authorities greater control. Some officials predicted that Aboriginal peoples would eventually disappear. They spoke as if extinction were inevitable, but Aboriginal people did not disappear. They endured, and their survival proved those predictions wrong. Over time, the methods of control began to change. Open conflict did not completely end, but governments increasingly relied on laws, missions, and reserves. Officials were appointed to manage Aboriginal lives. They could control where people lived. They could restrict where people travelled. They could influence who people married. In some places, they controlled employment and wages. Governments described these policies as protection, but protection often meant surveillance. It meant segregation. It meant taking away basic choices. And eventually, it meant something even more destructive. The authorities began taking children. For generations, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children were removed from their families. Some were taken by government authorities. Others were removed through churches or welfare organisations. Many were sent to institutions. Others were placed with non-Indigenous families. Children were often discouraged from speaking their own languages. They were separated from their cultures. Some were told their parents were dead. Others were told their families no longer wanted them. Many of those claims were false. Imagine being a child and suddenly being taken from everything you recognize. You do not know where you are going. You do not know when you will return. You wait for someone from your family to find you, but no one comes. Years pass. Your mother's voice becomes difficult to remember. The road back to your country becomes harder to find. And one day, you realize that the people who took you never intended to send you home. These children became known as the stolen generations. The pain did not disappear when they became adults. Many spent years searching for their parents. Some found their families too late. Others never found them at all. Aboriginal people did not wait silently for the country to change. They organised. They wrote petitions. They held strikes. They marched. They demanded to be heard. In 1938, Australia celebrated 150 years since the arrival of the First Fleet. But Aboriginal activists refused to celebrate. They declared a day of mourning. Their message was clear. A country could not celebrate progress while ignoring the people harmed in creating it. In 1966, Gurindji workers walked off Wave Hill Station. The protest began over poor wages and working conditions, but it became something larger. The Gurindji were not simply asking for better treatment. They were demanding the return of their land. Their walk-off became a defining moment in the struggle for land rights. In 1967, Australians voted in a historic referendum. Nearly 91% voted in favour of constitutional change. It was one of the strongest yes votes in Australian history. The result allowed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to be included in official population counts. It also gave the Commonwealth Parliament greater power to make laws concerning them. The referendum did not immediately create equality. It did not automatically return stolen land. And despite a common misunderstanding, it was not simply the moment Aboriginal people received voting rights, but it demonstrated something important. After decades of Aboriginal activism, the country could no longer pretend that change was unnecessary. A door had opened. The struggle was far from over, but the movement had become impossible to ignore. In 1972, 4 Aboriginal activists arrived outside Parliament House in Canberra. They carried a beach umbrella. They placed it on the lawn, and they called it the Aboriginal Tent Embassy. It appeared simple, but the meaning was powerful. An embassy usually represents one nation dealing with another. By calling their protest an embassy, the activists exposed a contradiction. Aboriginal people had lived on the continent for tens of thousands of years, yet the government treated them like outsiders in their own country. The protest began beneath a single umbrella. It grew into one of the longest-running Indigenous protest sites in the world. The activists were not asking the country to feel sorry for them. They were demanding land rights. They were demanding justice. They were demanding recognition. Koiki Mabo was a Miriam man from Mer Island in the Torres Strait. He understood that his community had its own system of land ownership. Families knew which land belonged to them. They maintained it. They inherited responsibilities for it. But Australian law was built upon the doctrine of terra nullius. The term implied that Australia had belonged to no one when Britain claimed it. Mabo knew this was untrue. He and the other Miriam plaintiffs challenged the doctrine in court. The case continued for years. Mabo carried the struggle forward, even though the final decision remained uncertain. Then, in January 1992, Mabo died. He never heard the judgment that would change Australian law. 5 months after his death, the High Court delivered its decision. The court rejected the legal fiction that Australia had been land belonging to no one. It recognised that native title could continue to exist. Mabo had challenged a national myth, and he had won. At first, this may seem like a story about a culture that nearly disappeared, but that is not the true story. The true story is that it never disappeared. Languages survived inside families. Ceremonies continued away from the eyes of authorities. Songs preserved knowledge when official records ignored it. Elders carried memories that governments had attempted to erase. Children who had been removed grew older and searched for their families. Communities worked to restore languages. Younger generations returned to country. The system had tried to transform Aboriginal people into someone else, but identity survived. Not because the system eventually became kind. It survived because generation after generation refused to let it die. In 1997, the Bringing Them Home report documented the experiences of the stolen generations. Survivors spoke publicly about what had happened to them. Their stories entered the national record. On February 13, 2008, the Australian Parliament formally apologised to the stolen generations. For many survivors, hearing the word sorry mattered. It acknowledged that the removals had caused real harm. But an apology could not return every lost childhood. It could not reunite every separated family. It could not restore every language that had fallen silent. Words could acknowledge the past. Healing would require more. When people describe Aboriginal culture as ancient, it can sound as if it belongs only to the past. But ancient does not mean extinct. It means the story began long ago, and it is still being told. Aboriginal history is not a side chapter in the history of Australia. It is the foundation beneath it. It is a history of knowledge, a history of resistance, a history of children taken from their families, a history of people who challenged governments, laws, and national myths. Above all, it is a history of survival. British colonisation began less than 250 years ago. Aboriginal cultures extend back at least 65,000 years. Colonisation represents only a small fraction of the human story of this continent, and yet, for too long, that fraction was presented as the entire story. Australia's oldest story was never erased. It was spoken quietly when speaking became dangerous. It was carried when communities were displaced. It was remembered when institutions demanded forgetting. And it continues today, not as an echo from a vanished world, but as a living voice. A voice belonging not only to Australia's past, but to its present and its future.